Welcome to New Week and New Monday, everyone. We had a very special guest on this week, Dr. Mark Ferro, a researcher out of the University of Waterloo who is riddled with achievements and awards. He is the Canadian Research Chair in Mental Health, the Director of the Arch Lab, the President of CSEB, has been the recipient of the BrainStar Award from CIHR, Early Researcher Award from the Ontario Ministry of Research, and the Early Career Award from Hamilton Health Sciences, to list a few. It was an honor to chat with him about the windy road that brought him from a background in biochemistry to his research in youth mental health, the strong relationship between physical and mental illnesses in children, and the strong need for more positive mental health resources and earlier interventions to help set our youth populations up for success. Enjoy. Welcome, Dr. Mark Ferro. For those who don't know, we are podcasts that are affiliated with the U Ottawa chapter of CSEB, but you are the president of the entire network, Canadian network of CSEB. And you are also the Canadian Research Chair in Youth Mental Health. You're also the director of the Arch Lab, and you're a professor and run that lab out of U Waterloo. So before we dig into what you're currently doing, I want to ask first, I'm just curious how you went from an undergrad in biochemistry to now studying children's health and like youth psychiatry.
Great. Thanks for having me, Gabby. It's a question that comes up often, and I don't think I'm, an outlier to most people in academia, in that it was a bit of a windy road. So I started off always liking chemistry and the chemistry of life, but realized soon, perhaps in my second or third year, that the wet lab just wasn't for me. I didn't enjoy running the experiments in the lab. I enjoyed studying, the mechanisms of protein folding and all that type of stuff. But the wet lab, I couldn't envision myself being there long term. And so at McMaster, where I did my undergrad, co-op doesn't start until the third year, unlike other programs. And so I went into the co-op program and took placements that were anywhere but in a lab setting. And so I ended up at a biotech company, in all places in their sales and marketing department. And in examining different clinical trials between drug A versus drug B and things like that, I gained an appreciation for epidemiology without really understanding what epidemiology was yet. It was very much trying to put in context, well, why is drug A reporting these results given the study design that they implemented? And how does that translate to our product, which is in direct competition? So there was always that underlying business model, but I became interested in epidemiology and health research methods.
Do you think?
So,
oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna ask about how you said you were so interested in the chemistry, but not the wet lab. And I was just gonna follow up asking, do you think that's why you went into, say, mental health, because of maybe like the chemistry going on that leads to like differences in, say, all the hormones that passed? Like, I'm just trying to wonder how that connection, but you were gonna continue, so I want to let you finish.
No, that it's a nice bridge actually, because having that basic science background has provided me an opportunity to think about child mental health and child mental health epidemiology in terms of the biological mechanisms that might underlie such associations. And so retaining that information has been helpful in linking and having collaborative efforts with basic scientists in behavioral neurosciences or in pure biochemistry, let's say, who will examine mental health models using animals or even in some cases, bacterium.
Mm-hmm. That's okay. Very, very cool how that led from one thing to another. And then, so leading into, you did your postdoc, you did two postdocs, you did one in pediatrics, one in child psychiatry. What were your sort of topics of interest in each of those, and how did that then lead to you creating the Arch Lab now and deciding that that's what you wanted to continue? Was the research the same, or did you continue the like, any changes in your interest from there?
Sure, there was a little bit of change, even going as far back as my master's degree into the doctorate. When I completed my doctorate, which was focusing on the quality of life of children with epilepsy, I became interested in the different aspects of quality of life and tried to figure out what aspect of quality of life was most impacted in these children who had childhood onset epilepsy. And it turns out it was the psychological well-being in that domain of quality of life. And so that got me interested in child mental health, and particularly the intersection between physical illness and mental illness in children and young people. So in completing the PhD, that first short-term postdoc I did in pediatrics, went to examine a little bit more the role of psychological well-being in the greater scheme of quality of life of children with epilepsy. And then I began to expand that outward to uh, really all chronic physical conditions in children and young people. Once that was completed, then I engaged in a longer term, more formal postdoc fellowship back at McMaster University under Dr. Michael Boyle. And from there, it really ballooned into focusing not just on psychological well-being, but on mental illness in children with a physical health problem. So really trying to understand what are the links between physical and mental illness really early in life.
Okay, very interesting. And how did you, when you form the Arch Lab, so how do you almost find what niche you want to, because you're doing a lot more than just say epilepsy, you're doing such a broad range of both youth mental health and now, I mean, that must give you so many topics that you can look into. There's never really an ending of where your research can go.
Yeah, it's really exciting, and that's probably something to think about for individuals who are embarking on a doctorate. The work you do during that time will almost always stay with you. So even though I'm not specifically immersed full time in childhood epilepsy, I always seem to have a hand in that field through established collaborations with former colleagues or former mentors. But it was one of those things where I didn't feel that I wanted to just stay in the pediatric epilepsy or in pediatric neurology, in that there may be similar mechanisms at play for children with other chronic conditions. And so I just wanted to expand my field of interest in that regards. And you're right, there is a lot going on. So right now, as part of my Canada Research Chair and through the direction of the Arch Lab, is to understand the links or the associations between physical illness and mental illness in children and young people. And that in and of itself is quite broad. Not only are we interested in pure associations at the epidemiologic level, but also at a clinical level. We're interested in understanding why children with a physical illness are at increased risk for mental illness. What are the underlying biological, but also psychosocial mechanisms that would link physical and mental illness? And also for which segments of our population of young people are at elevated risk for mental illness after having been diagnosed with a physical health problem. So there are many opportunities there, and that comes back to my biochem background in understanding some of the inflammatory markers or even stress hormones that might mediate the relationship between physical and mental illness. As the work has progressed, I've become more interested, and mainly due to interest from my graduate students in understanding mental health service use among children with co-occurring physical and mental health problems, or the term we like to use is multimorbidity. And this has become quite interesting for us because there are really two sides to the debate. Are children with multimorbidity more likely to use mental health services because they have contacts with the healthcare system, and so there may be more likely for referral to mental health services? The other side of the argument could be that, well, no, it's their physical illness that dominates any type of interaction with the healthcare system. And so mental health could be set aside to the back burner and not get addressed appropriately for these children and their families. And then the third part of the work that we're doing is more methodological, and that really focuses on the measurement of mental health as well as quality of life in children and young people, trying to understand whether scales that were developed in one population can be applied in a valid and reliable manner to other segments of the population.
Okay, well, okay, I have quite a few questions that came from that. But before I dive into them, the first thing I want to say is I really like that you touched that despite you doing something more niche in your PhD, that everything you can do after has sort of broadened around it. Because I know even in my program, those who are deciding whether they want to do a PhD or not, they sort of have this fear that if they go so niche in their PhD that they have to be stuck in that role and have to be stuck only looking at that forever. So I like that you pointed out that it can go broad afterwards, and it's not you're not committing to something in your PhD that you can never sort of expand from.
Sure. So it's a really good point. You're absolutely right. You don't want to limit yourself in terms of the opportunities that present yourself. My particular bias is at the graduate level for the master's in epidemiology or biostatistics. Really focus on the skill sets. Gather as much information and knowledge you can on different methodologies and analytic techniques. Of course, you want to be interested and motivated in your substantive area, but the more skills you can develop through your master's degree, you can then lead that into a doctorate where you perhaps find that niche area that you want to spend the next 4 to 5 years for your thesis. You're then going to want to think about, okay, once that's done during your postdoc, you're not going to want to make a complete right-hand turn away from what you've been doing for the past 4 or 5 years, but slowly start to expand that and ensure that you created a bit of a focus that you've become an expert in.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. And coming back to your current research that you said you're looking at multimorbidities. So you have one of the big sort of projects is called My Life. So that is looking at, say, the relationship between physical and mental illnesses, as well as sort of following mental health along the projection of a child's life to see sort of how they develop. What are, based on what you've found so far, what are sort of key takeaways in terms of when you have a child, like what's the best way to sort of approach potentially if they have any physical problem or like issues or mental health issues, how to navigate that, how to sort of set them up for success to maybe not have it go in a completely like not damaging side, but like one that could really hurt them potentially. How do you sort of give them the best tools if you know that they're in that situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can't comment completely on the My Life study yet because data collection are still ongoing, and we've completed baseline in 6 months, and at baseline, we are seeing that the incidence of mental illness in children who are newly diagnosed with a physical health problem is high. The burden is there, ranging between 25 to about 40%, depending on whether we have the child reporting themselves or parents proxy report. So we are getting different perspectives from parents and children. And that's not uncommon. We're seeing relatively low levels of agreement between what parents say and what the children themselves say with regards to psychological functioning, mental health, quality of life. What's most interesting and something I really believe in is the non-categorical approach to understanding multimorbidity, especially in children. What we're finding is that regardless of the type of physical condition a child may have, their risk for mental illness seems relatively similar So whether it's epilepsy, diabetes, asthma, juvenile arthritis, that measure of association is pretty similar across those conditions for whatever mental health outcome we're interested in, whether it be generalized anxiety or major depression. But if we take any one of those physical conditions and compare them to healthy controls, let's say, there's a very large difference that the children with a physical health problem are at increased risk. And so what's exciting about this, it's not so much the type of illness, is that there is some sort of underlying inherent risk, whether it's psychosocial in nature, whether it's biologic in nature, we're not sure yet. But it's leading us to investigate these different mechanisms and also has potential for practice and policy implications. So if we do identify potential targets for intervention, they can be scaled up and used across the different outpatient clinics because, respective of the type of condition, there seems to be this common target to perhaps reduce the incidence of mental illness or at least promote positive mental health in children with a physical health problem.
A super quick question about you mentioning the disparity between children and their parents. Do you find the parents have a lot lower of like there's a lot less potentially like mental health related back from the parents, or do they almost think there's more happening than the kids are telling you? Like what direction is it in?
Right. So typically, what we see for quality of life, let's say, is that parents tend to have a negative bias in that they report lower quality of life scores for their children, and children report higher quality of life scores. With respect to the mental health domains, parents typically report more emotional or behavioral problems in children versus the children themselves.
Wow, I was thinking the opposite, that the parents would think everything's fine and then the kids are sort of internal. That's really interesting actually, that I was the opposite of what I thought.
It's an interesting phenomenon because really there is no gold standard or truth. It's a perspective that each informant is providing, and neither one is incorrect or correct, depending on the way you look at it. Uh, but it really just speaks to the importance of uh, getting multiple informants when trying to assess mental health or quality of life, any number of psychosocial outcomes in children and young people.
And I have one last quick question, bringing it back to current times. And I mean, we all know that this pandemic is not doing wonders on the mental health of everyone. But children specifically, how do you think that this, I mean, are they young enough that maybe they don't quite understand what's going on? Maybe they're still able to, like, at home, they're still doing online like, do you think this will have as profound an impact on children as maybe parents, or because it's having such an impact on the parents and the rest of us that will negatively sort of trickle into children?
I think it's having an impact on everyone. The level of impact is obviously varying across individuals and segments of our population. I think what we need to do is ensure that there are resources in place so that we can foster resiliency and flourishing, if in children specifically, given that that's my focus. I think that worrying and having a sense of apprehension about the future during this pandemic, those are just normal feelings that individuals, children as well, will have and will continue to have as we're undergoing these various countermeasures and ordinances within the province. What we need to do is ensure different types of resources that are available to work at the various levels of preventive interventions at a population level. So, at a very primary level, ensure that we are fostering positive mental health for individuals, ensure that they have the supports needed to uh, really flourish given the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic. At a secondary level, for those children who are exhibiting elevated symptoms, more comprehensive assessments are needed early on. And so connections or integrating the physical and mental health services for children and families would be important so that comprehensive assessment can happen earlier and appropriate treatment, if needed, can occur on a case-by-case basis. And then, of course, at a tertiary level, for those children who do have mental illness or mental disorder, regardless of the pandemic, to ensure that they receive the interventions and the supportive care needed so that we can optimize their quality of life and their functioning with respect to social interactions within the family and academic functioning.
Do you think that coming out of this, there will be more resiliency from everyone after having sort of endured it? Or do you think in the moment right now, everyone's sort of struggling, they need that mental health, as you said, or mental health help potentially, as you said, and the positive communication to get through it? Do you think once we're out of it, that trend continues? Or do you think once we're out of it, there's sort of that reflection and looking back and the resiliency building, if that makes sense?
Well, no, I understand your question, and I think it's the $1 million question right now. We just don't know. The longer the pandemic continues and the reintroduction of lockdown measures in certain parts of the province obviously have negative impacts on our social functioning and our mental health. The extent to which we can, as a population, come out and be resilient, I think it's going to take some time as we adjust to a new normal. But again, it speaks to the importance of having the supports necessary at the population level, but also targeted interventions for those children and families who are deemed at elevated risk because of their physical health status or because of their social functioning or other compounded effects.
Well, personally, I'm looking forward to, I know you have the COVID arm of your My Life study. So I'm looking forward to, I'm sure that with any research, it takes a while we're still in the process of collecting all the data and when it comes out. But I'm very curious and interested on what that will tell us about all this, because again, it's such no one's ever lived through this before, really, in current times. It's going to be interesting over the next few years to see what comes out of it and how we are on the other side. So I'm looking forward to that. And if anyone else wants to follow along, you have your ArchLab website that has all these projects listed. And I think it's very, very timely and very interesting as mental health is coming to light so much. It was before the pandemic, but especially during the pandemic. And I hope that we do learn something and we do provide more resources, because I know that's been a common criticism throughout this, that people feel like there's not enough out there for them to go reach out. Even in Ottawa, to see a therapist, it takes like 6 months if you're going to see someone in the public sector, and maybe even 2 to 3 months even in the private sector. And it's like, if you need someone right now, what do you do? So that's a very big area that we definitely need more resources put into.
Absolutely, I agree. There are bottlenecks in the system, and we're starting to see some of these gaps in care because they've been compounded by the pandemic. The hope is that we can really plug these gaps sooner than later, because this won't be the last pandemic. There will be other quote unquote crises that will hit us at a population level. And so if we can have a health system that can adapt to the needs of children and families, I think it'll just put us on a better footing as we move forward.
Okay, well, I know I don't want to keep you too long and I have to go, but thank you so much. This was very interesting personally. I love hearing more about what people learn from mental health, because I didn't do my background in that. So I'm so curious, especially with it coming to light. I really enjoyed chatting with you about it. And I am looking forward to seeing what comes out more with your research about it all. So thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. This was great. My first podcast.
Woo! Glad we made the cut.
That's great.
It only makes sense, I guess, or what's the word, that it's C-sub. That's how we got you in. So
Absolutely.
Wouldn't be a C-Sub podcast without you. So
thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning into our show. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something in the process. If you too want to stay up to date with Dr. Ferro's research on children's health, head to archlab.ca. That's ARCH, or arch_lab on Twitter. And as always, please rate, review, and follow us here and on Instagram and Twitter at Behind the Numbers with no E in numbers. Have a great week and see you next Monday.